Hello there, my name is Michael O'Sullivan and I'm a software engineer with IBM API Connect. And today I'm going to be talking to you about extending your API management maturity with advanced API governance and security in IBM API Connect. And this is a short version of a presentation I delivered at the IBM Tech Exchange Conference 2024 in Las Vegas. And I'll be showcasing a demo of these capabilities in API Connect as well. So API governance is actually a very broad topic. In the context of this presentation today, when I talk about API governance, what I'm referring to is the comprehensive set of standards, policies, and practices that cover how an organization will develop APIs, deploy them, and how they get used as well. So let's take an example of what we mean by this. I have here an example of an OpenAPI document uploaded into IBM API Connect as a draft API in YAML format. And of course, API Connect already allows you to validate that your OpenAPI document is compliant with the OpenAPI specification. And that's exactly what we see here. You can see the little green tick icon on the left-hand side of the validate button. So at first glance, everything in this OpenAPI document seems okay. And you might think, I can publish this OpenAPI document in confidence now. However, with the API governance capability of API Connect, we can also validate it against governance policies using rulesets. So let's have a look. But it actually turns out that revalidating this OpenAPI document with API governance rules highlights several different concerns of different severity. We see 51 findings here in total in this set of results. Why should you care that your OpenAPIs are compliant with these governance policies? And as I list here, there are numerous reasons, from inconsistency being a problem, the adoption of common standards and conventions, complying with your organizational policies, the need to reduce the duplication of APIs, ensuring and having peace of mind that your APIs are secured and are not at risk of security attacks. The result of these things is it makes sure that your APIs are well structured, secure, easier to consume and interact with, which will help ensure the popularity and success of your open APIs. So, API governance and API Connect. The governance capabilities of API Connect are essentially organized around rule sets with rules. Rules can be used to actually check that an OpenAPI document is compliant with a particular policy. API Connect provides an experience to actually create and manage these rule sets with their rules right from within API Connect. A developer can then use these rule sets with the rules to actually validate that their OpenAPI documents are compliant with those rules. Once a developer has done that, they can export the results of these validations against the rule sets in the format of a scorecard that gives you a complete breakdown of what particular rules an OpenAPI document is not compliant with. This capability is available on our API Connect Toolkit CLI, which means this can provide you with full CI/CD and DevOps integration. API Governance Service in API Connect uses the very widely used open source Spectral engine. This is a linter that compars the structure of OpenAPI documents, and this is what's used to ensure that the documents are compliant with the rules of the rule sets within your provider organization. So what makes a rule? What does a spectral rule actually look like? I have an example of one here on the left-hand side in JSON format. So point number one, we have a name. Every rule has to have a unique name within that particular rule set. And from the name here, you can tell that the idea of this rule is to check that an OpenAPI document is compliant with semantic versioning. That is, an OpenAPI document that has a version in the format major.minor.patch. Point number two is the severity. So what is the severity of this finding if an OpenAPI document violates this rule? Spectral provides different severities out of the box, including error, in this case, warning, or even information level severity. The idea being that if an OpenAPI presents an error finding, then you might not want to publish that OpenAPI until it's remediated. If you look at point number three, you have a list of formats. So Spectral supports applying these rules to OpenAPI 2, i.e. Swagger-Doc formats, and OAS 3, which is the more modern OpenAPI 3 format. ISO number 4 is given. So the given property tells Spectral where in the OpenAPI document to look to check the compliance with the rule. And of course, this is a JSON path expression. So in this case, it's saying at the root of the documents, go into the info block and look at the field called version. And then finally, you have element number 5, which is the then block. And this is what Spectral should do at the given field to actually check that it's compliant. So Spectral has a whole range of out-of-the-box functions that it can use. And in this situation here, inside our then block, you see it's using the pattern function. And this particular function takes a pattern options object with this match property. And of course, that looks like a regular expression. This rule is going to apply a regular expression pattern match to the value of the info.version field to check that it is compliant with that regular expression. So now it's time for a demo of the API governance capabilities within API Connect. And I'm logged into an API Connect instance on cloud here, and I'm on the home page of the API Manager user interface. From here, I'm going to navigate to my develop page, where I can see all of my draft APIs. So I'm going to focus in on this Acme Airlines Flight API version 1.5.0. I'm going to validate the API using rulesets. So I go to the validate menu here and say with rulesets. And I get a view here of all of the rulesets available to me within my provider organization. At the moment, I just have some global out-of-the-box rulesets. I have none of my own. And for this demonstration, I'm just going to pick one ruleset, this spectral OWASP ruleset, which contains rules that make sure that APIs conform to the OWASP API Security Top 10 recommendations. So I'll press that and say next. And now we get a view of the 32 rules that are within this rule set. I could unselect individual rules that I do not want to run as part of this validation, but for now I'll leave them all selected. And now I'll press validate. And let's see what I find. So I have 131 findings within this OpenAPI of error and warning severity. So I'm trying to study these findings in the scorecard for this API, and I've prepared a newer version of the API that should address at least the errors in the scorecard report. So I'm going to press done, and from here what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new version of this API. I'm going to call it 1.6.0 and submit. Now, I've worked on the fixes for this API offline in my local IDE, and I've just copied them onto my clipboard, and I'm simply going to paste them in here, copy paste, and overwrite everything that's already here. What could possibly go wrong, right? So I've pasted in my newer version of the API, and I'll press save. And now what I'll do is I'll validate again with rulesets, and we'll see have I been able to address at least all of the errors of this API. These error severity findings. And I have, and I'm left with just the 49 warnings of that API. So good. Well, I'm going to go back to the original version of the API. And what have I done? So what have I actually changed in this API? So if I go back to version 1.5, which was the original version. So here we go. If I filter it down to error, you see some of the findings here, for example. Let me just make this list a bit bigger. So write operation not protected by any security scheme. Schema of type array must specify max items. Schema of type integer must specify format in 32 or in 64. All 2xx and 4xx responses should define rate limiting headers. If I look at what I did, I have now defined a security scheme for all operations within the OpenAPI. This one here, I've defined this security flight auth scheme. I've defined access and rate limiting control headers, which address that particular finding about the lack of rate limiting. For schemas, for example, of type array, I've specified maximum number of items that array can have to prevent, for example, buffer overflow attacks. So all of these things will help ensure the quality, consistency, and security of the API once I implement them. So this is looking good. So that was just looking at one individual API that's not published yet. But what about all of the APIs that I already have published? For example, if I go into Manage and I click into this staging catalog, I have 2 published APIs here already. If there's governance findings with those APIs, I probably need to correct them very quickly because they're already live on a gateway being used by the public. How can I find out if these particular APIs all in one go have issues that I need to correct? And I can do that from the governance user interface. So on the left-hand side menu here, we have the governance icon. And what I can do is use this scanning capability. So scanning allows me to scan all of the APIs published to a catalog or a space at one go. So let's try it. I'll create a new scan of the staging catalog. And I'll pick the spectral OWASP rule set once again. And I'll pick all of the rules. And I'll give it a name that I'm familiar with. So I'll say staging scan Monday, which is today. and start the scan. Now, scanning can take some time depending on how many APIs you have or depending on how many rule sets you choose. So what happens is this gets put into a job queue and runs in the background. In this case, it ran very, very quickly, so it's now finished. There's one available report. We have 55 errors and 118 warnings across all of the APIs, of which there's 2. I only picked 1 rule set, so there's relatively few findings. But amongst all APIs, there's 173 findings in total. Now, catalogs and APIs that get published to catalogs can change all the time. So for example, what if I want to rerun that scan against that catalog without having to walk through the wizard and pick and configure my scan again? I can do that from the rescan option. So I can press rerun and that will queue the job to be rescanned. And that has worked. This scan is quite intelligent. If there's no changes in the catalog, which there weren't in this case, it won't change anything. It'll only scan differences, deltas. So now I've got 2 reports available. So if I click back into this, I can then navigate between all the individual occurrences of these scorecard reports. And I can even export them in CSV or PDF format. Now, governance in API Connect is more than just scanning and validating. It also provides the capability for us to manage rule sets. So that's available from the rulesets tab here on the governance page. At the top, I would see all of the rule sets available to me within my provider organization. I haven't created any yet, so the table is empty. But if I look down at the bottom, I see the global rule sets. And these are the rule sets that are provided to me out of the box within API Connect, such as the spectral OWASP one that we saw earlier. So if I want to create a new rule set, I can use API Connect to do that from the Add menu. I can either import one that I already have, for example, from another spectral instance, or I can create one from scratch. But what I'll do for this demo is come down to the out of the box rule sets and I'll pick one. So let's expand the range of rule sets I have here. In addition to the spectral ones, we have some IBM ones, and I'll pick this IBM info rule set. If I click on this icon here, I can save this to bootstrap the creation of my own rule set. So I'll say save as rule set. I have to give it a name, and I'll call it Acme Info at version 1, and I'll save that. And that now appears up here in the provider organization rule sets table, because this is a rule set that now just exists within my provider organization. When a rule set is created, it's created in draft state, which means I can work on it, I can edit it until I'm ready to publish it for use. For any rule set that's in draft state, I would not be able to use it to scan catalogs or spaces, and nor would I be able to use it to validate individual APIs from the Develop tab. So now I can click into that rule set, and I'm provided with a form-based editor that allows me to customize that rule set, such as the title and the description and some optional tags. But furthermore, I can also look into individual rules, such as this contact rule. And again, it's the same form-based editor that allows me to set, or edit in this case, all of the properties of a spectral rule that I described on the slide earlier, such as the title, description, severity, given, and the then block. It also provides me with this source view editor. So again, if I prefer working with the rule sets and the rules in YAML formats, I can do so from here. What this will also allow me to do in this particular situation is I can create a new rule within this rule set. And that's exactly what I'm going to do now. Or the title of my rule, which is gateway target URL present, and the description. Ensure that the target URL to be used by the gateway is present. And I can press create. And then I can now fill out the rest of the properties of this rule. Okay, so now I have filled in the remaining properties, such as the message that should be displayed if the rule is triggered, i.e. if an API violates the rule. I've left error severity. And for given, I said look in the X IBM configuration block of the OpenAPI document. And from within there, look in the properties.target URL field. And I'm using the truthy function to mandate that it must be there. So I'm going to select save those changes, and now they're saved. So now I could use the validate option to validate this rule against any of my draft APIs just to test that it works as desired before I publish this rule for others in my provider organization to use. But for the sake of this short demo, I'm going to be very brave. So I'm going to go back to the governance page and I'm just going to publish it. So I'm going to come to the 3 little dots here and say publish. Bearing in mind, once I've published it, I can no longer edit the rule. Or rule set rather. So I'll publish. And that is done. Now, let's flip back to the Develop tab, and I'll go back into that 1.6 version of my Acme Airlines Flight API. I'll go to Validate, and I'll pick rulesets. And now I get my Acme info rule set available to me to select because it's published. So I'll press Next. I get all the rules selected by default, including my new rule that I added to that rule set, which is gateway target URL present. And I haven't run this rule set against this API before, so I'm going to leave all of them selected, including my new one. I don't expect this one should trigger because, of course, I copied this API from version 1.5, which did have the target URL present. So that should not trigger at all. So let's press Validate and confirm that. Oh dear, it does trigger. Target URL is missing from IBM configuration. I see some other issues as well. The info object must contain either a contact email or a contact URL, which I definitely do not have. And API must reference the URL of its terms of service in the info block. So some interesting findings that I should use to continue to improve my API before I publish it from this other IBM info rule set that I've now extended into my own Acme info rule sets, and I can see that here. So what about the target URL? A bit of an investigation, and when I look at my OpenAPI and I scroll to the bottom, I can see in my IBM configuration I have assembly execute invoke, and I've got the target URL property here pointing at the target URL variable, which is what the rule was supposed to look for. But you can clearly see here that I do not have IBM configuration properties target URL defined. In fact, I don't have a properties section at all. And would you believe it, if I look at version 1.5 of the OpenAPI that I started from, IBM configuration block, I can see here the missing properties.target URL section that is missing from version 1.6 of the OpenAPI. I guess I should never have copy pasted it to start with. That was a bad idea. Hope you found this video helpful and informative in regards to understanding why it's important to ensure that your APIs are compliant with best practice governance and security policies, and just how the API governance capabilities of API Connect are able to help you achieve this. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you out there in the API ecosystem.